And one of the things I came up with are the myths, and this will be about the only one of the two text charts that I'll have. One is that subs are dangerous. And the issue here is you have to separate research and commercial submersibles from military submersibles, which carry munitions and go to dangerous places. Research submersibles don't go in areas where the bottom of the area they're operating in is greater than the crush depth of the submersible, which is what really kills you. So that's one of the big differences. And in the last 35 years, there hasn't been a serious injury, and there have been over 15 million people go in them. Now, most of those are in tourist submersibles, but they're statistically the safest vehicles on the planet.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. That was OceanGate CEO Stockton Rush at the Explorers Club in New York on April 10th, 2017. This was basically his manifesto, his business plan, his pitch. It's downright spooky seeing and hearing the captain of the Titan, the CEO of OceanGate, lecture a room full of explorers at the Explorers Club about how safe submersibles are. In his words, the safest form of travel. Is it really? Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you who have subscribed. Welcome to the channel. I did say I was going to be doing an analysis of an incredible article by the editor of Travel Weekly. Well, I'll be doing that following this analysis. I thought I would do this one first. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. The safest form of travel, is it really? It's pretty incredible. Ironic is perhaps a better word. His number one myth is that submersibles are dangerous. In other words, his number one pitch is to argue for how ridiculously safe they are. And somewhere he actually uses a word like ridiculous. He says submersibles are obscenely safe. Well, I think he says the rules and regulations around them make the industry obscenely safe. Now, I'm no engineer, but I do know the English language. I can read and write, and I've actually read a few books and I've written a few books. But in his own words, in fact, the very first word of his number one myth argument is the word classed. In other words, certified. He's not saying it's a myth that submersibles are dangerous. He's saying classed submersibles are safe. He's saying that there have been no major industries in 35 years, but this is the important point, in classed submersibles. And then he brings up his third point, that this is the safest form of travel. Now, I wouldn't describe going down into the crushing depths where the Titanic lies as travel, or as safe travel as a kind of default setting. I mean, if you went to Mars for the first time and there was no incident, would you call that the safest form of travel because someone got there and got back, and so you've got a 100% safety record on one trip? And then another person does that. It's a little bit of a different situation. I think one's got to be clear about that. According to the Scientific American, now just with coming back to this idea of safe travel, let's compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. Let's not compare driving a car or going in an aeroplane to extreme deep sea exploration, right? So according to the Scientific American, quote, the pressure around the famous sunken ship, the Titanic, is about 375 atmospheres. That means every square inch of an object's surface experiences the equivalent of 5,500 pounds of force. And then they go on to provide a really practical illustration. Sometimes it's hard to imagine what they're talking about, but they say such an amount is greater than the bite pressure exerted by some of the strongest jaws in the animal kingdom. Crocodile bites have been measured up to 3,700 psi, that's pounds of force essentially. And then one computer modeling study estimated that a relatively large great white sinks its teeth into prey with a force of almost 4,000 psi. I wonder whether they measured a hyena's bite when they did that study. In any event, if there's one vehicle on the planet, as I say, that explores the inside of a volcano, and there's never been a collision between that type of vehicle and another vehicle, that hardly makes it safe, or for that matter, safe travel. It's taking a statistic and distorting it out of context. Somewhere else in his presentation, he talks about being able to get in and out of the hatch in minutes. And as far as I know, unbolting those bolts, is it 11 bolts? Somewhere I heard that doesn't it take about an hour? And the way he was describing it, it sounds like you just quickly open the hatch. And it's a better alternative. It's also easy to see how Stockton Rush came upon his recipe for his own Kool-Aid. In order to save on expense, one has to mitigate the ship support side of things. He recognized very early on that the most expensive aspect, or certainly one of the most expensive aspects, is the ship that's got to be chartered. And the way to do that is to design a submersible small and light enough to be conveyed by a relatively smaller ship. And we can see by 2023 he was very much doing that, by then not even having the sub on board anymore and towing it along like a bucking bronco attached to the back of a freight train. We can also see how the traditional shape, which is a sort of gold standard for ultra-deep submersibles, this sort of round spherical shape, was passé for an innovating entrepreneur. I think more an innovating entrepreneur than an engineer, who saw an opportunity to stretch it out into a cylinder, thus allowing him to prop a few extra piggies inside. That lightweight cylinder that seemed to make economic sense is precisely the part that still hasn't been recovered from the debris field, possibly because it shattered into 1 million fragments when it imploded. I've just learned now in this presentation that the inner lining of that cylinder was actually stainless steel, not even titanium. It's also bizarre how the CEO opens up his lecture with references to movies, and he peppers his lecture with movies throughout that. The Rock is another reference. And he says he became an astronaut because he watched Star Trek and Star Wars. Basically, he was activated, it seems, by science fiction, but more particularly fiction. And although you might say that is fair, maybe that happens to a lot of us, it does make one wonder to what extent he's become hypnotized by magical thinking. He got an engineering degree not because he was interested in engineering, but because it would be his ticket to being an astronaut. And so the problem with the Titan is that it lacks certified engineering, while being in a rush to get where it wants to go. But crucially, without paying the full price that the safe industry was touting demanded. Yes, it was safe if you obeyed the rules. He seemed to want to dance on both sides of the line, trade on the safety record of the industry on the one hand, while cutting costs on actual safety in terms of his own project. Another irony, which for me is excruciating in its one-sided blindness, is Rush talking about using specialized equipment in order to measure and record how much Titanic's hull has decayed.
We also have used sonar systems, but the visibility is quite good. We just reached agreement with company 3D at Depth that does laser scanning. So you can create a laser image quite rapidly that's almost as good as a photograph. And it doesn't just take the picture, it gives you this 3D model so that when we go back the next year, we can tell if the hull has decayed. So there's an argument out there.
I mean, if only he could have paid that same kind of attention to the Titanic, to measuring distortions in the Titanic to his own submersible. And then he talks about something else. He punts the carbon fiber as better than titanium. It's around about halfway into his lecture. I'll obviously put a link to the whole thing in the description, and I recommend you watch the whole thing. But once again, it's a kind of one-sided or one-dimensional blindness.
On top of this is commercial-grade carbon fiber, and built it up to 5 inches thick. Carbon fiber in subsea vehicles is really the right substance to use. It's 3 times better on a strength to buoyancy basis than titanium, the next best thing. So everyone wants to use titanium, but it's not strength to weight that you care about, it's strength to buoyancy. So our hull is going to be positively buoyant, which is what you want in a submersible. If you look at those other subs, they're all big and fat, and that's because they have all this syntactic foam because they're too heavy. If you're light, it's a lot easier to add lead than it is to add foam.
Now, when I talk about what this editor of Travel Weekly, what his impression was of Stockton Rush, this was earlier this year in May, he describes him as cocky. Well, think about the statement that he makes. He says carbon fiber in subsea vehicles, strangely he doesn't say submersibles, is really the right substance to use. It's 3 times better on a strength to buoyancy basis than titanium, which is the next best thing. He's saying titanium is the next best thing. It's quite a cocky statement that he's making. Like the reference to safety in his number 1 myth, this is a selective reading of the word strength. What is the strength relative to pressure and pressure cycling? That's the real determining factor. But specifically of titanium, the strength relative to pressure and pressure cycling of titanium versus carbon fiber. One somehow has the impression the CEO either didn't know to ask this question, or if and when he didn't want to know or be told the answer. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.